April 9th, 1993. 4 young men, all between the ages of 15 to 18, close friends since middle school, would attend a small party in Jamaica Street, El Paso, Texas. The 4 boys, Jesse Hernandez, Juan Medina, Robert England, and Armando Losso, were all planning on getting a lift home from this party with a cousin of Jesse's, Hector. At some point in the night, Hector drives away from the party with some other friends and says that he will be back soon to take them home. The night gets late, and after waiting for almost 2 hours, the group are told by the parents who own the house that it's time for them to leave. All 4 boys do so, but they stay out the front of the house in the street, where they continue to wait for their lift. Another hour goes by, and after having had enough of waiting, they come up with a new plan. The boys would head to Armando's house because he didn't live too far away, and from there he could borrow his mother's car and give everyone lifts home. They begin to walk and choose a route along a main highway instead of the less busy and poorly lit Fairbanks Drive, as you can see on the map now. Taking this path would make their trip a little longer, but the reason they did so was that the neighborhood they were in was known to be a rather dangerous one at times, an area with high gang activity. So being on the busier, well-lit highway made them feel a lot safer. As mentioned, the year of this party was 1993, but the testimony you're about to hear occurred in 2018, 25 years after the events that took place on that night.
We walked heading east, but when we got to Kellogg Street, a car pulled up. And first instincts was, hey, my cousins picked us up. But Mondo and Bobby, they saw the car first because they were in front of me. And when this car pulls up, they start yelling at the car. And then I look at the car and I say, that's not my cousin's car.
And so at first you think it is your cousin?
Yes.
All right.
I mean, why else would anybody pull over and just stop right there on a busy street? I'm sure it's Mondo and Bobby were pretty irate because for the fact that we had to walk. And they left us there for quite a considerable time. So they were angry and they were yelling at the cars like, what the hell are you doing? What took you forever? And I'm grabbing Mondo by the shoulder and I'm telling him, that's not my cousin's car. And he says, the hell it ain't. That is your cousin. I said, that's not the car. Look at the car. It's not their car. The car decides to leave, but it never leaves the block of Kellogg. It just pulls further in and it turns into the street. It stops. And at that moment, we thought we were going to have a confrontation. We thought that they were going to get out of the car and confront us, but that never happened. So I'm not even saying a minute goes by, it decides to leave, but it doesn't leave more than a couple of feet, and then it stops.
So we approached it, and it started going up every time we would approach it, and then it kept doing it for a while, and then they just took off.
This motion of the vehicle moving forward slightly as the boys approach and then repeating is described as a game of cat and mouse. And during this, Jesse identifies the vehicle as a 1976 Monte Carlo. Although finding the moment to be a little strange, the boys weren't too worried and continue walking home. They decide to cut through what was at the time an ungated empty corner lot, and as they're making their way through it, Armando Losso takes off his shirt and begins to wrestle with Robert. Jesse Hernandez is frustrated that this is happening as he wants to get home, and he is telling the boys to stop goofing around. Whilst this is occurring, the boys notice a car turn into the side street that was running next to the lot that they were in.
I remember seeing a car just coming through here and going all the way out this way, and then went down this way and parked right there. But at this point when it got here, it turned off its lights. I figured it was Hector playing a prank on us. By the time we got about here, the car was already there, and we approached it. I was thinking like, hey, that's Hector, you know. And so we were telling him like, hey, why did you leave us here? That's not cool. So as we were exchanging words, we were all saying something. I can't remember what we were saying, but I mean, I know I was like, hey, why did you leave us here? My hands in the air, you know.
Kind of upset.
Yeah, you know, it wasn't cool, so.
That's when words were yelled out from the car. I don't know if I can say them in the court, but it was a Spanish saying. They just said, Que putos. That's what they said. That's all it was. I remember was que putos.
And that's clearly not friendly,
No.
right?
I just stood in like, oh, what the heck is going to happen right now? And I remember Mondo and Bobby saying, what? So they said, what? And all I remember him saying was, your mama. That's all he said was your mama.
Who said that?
That was Bobby.
Okay.
When Bobby said your mama, he started to approach the car. And I'm not saying, he probably took about maybe 3-4 steps, and then shots were fired. I remember a glowing light, and I hear a ping, like if one hit the fence.
One had just passed by me, and I heard it ricochet off the chain, off the fence.
Okay.
By then I turn around, I see a spark. With that spark comes a gunshot, and several right after that one. And I just say run.
I just ran as fast as I could.
We started running. I see him look back, and I said, "Come on, just keep running. They could run. If anything, we'll meet at Blockbuster or further down. We'll catch up to them."
You know, I mean, adrenaline kicks in, so I didn't worry about Juan, Mondo, or Bobby. It was more like self-defense, where I just needed to get the heck out of there.
Okay. I think you run to a major video. Does that sound right?
Back
Was
then,
that the name of
they
it
were
back?
called like major players or major something like that.
Okay.
I don't remember if someone was in there, but I just kept shaking the door and it wouldn't open. And this whole time I'm thinking, you know, the car must be around here. You know, it's probably going to come back for us. It's going to come for us. And Juan is telling me, you know what, we need to go back. And I'm telling him, no, we're not going to go back. Let's go home, and I'll get with Mondo and Bobby to see if they're okay. But at that time, I wasn't thinking straight. Juan was, I would say, I guess he had gathered himself much faster than I did,
Okay.
because I was still in panic mode. He kept persisting that we needed to go back and check up on Mondo and Bobby.
Okay, so let's break down this. You're roughly saying it's...
Robert had been hit in the head and was lifeless on the ground, whilst Armando had been shot in the leg and the stomach, and was still able to move. He staggers to the nearest house as quick as he can, and begins pounding on the front door. The residents of this house were Nancy and George Gorham. At the time of this trial in 2018, both of these individuals had passed away, but statements and testimony that they had previously provided in 1995 were read. Nancy says that just after midnight, she had awoken to the sound of 5 or 6 gunshots. Less than 30 seconds later, there was a frantic knocking on her front door. She wakes her husband up, and he checks what is going on outside, whilst she calls 911. George Gorham finds Armando collapsed on his porch and says that the boy was barely conscious, and within 5 minutes of making the 911 call, police arrive on scene.
Can you show us approximately where you saw EMS, the fire personnel, treating a person?
It was right around this area, underneath the little porch right there. He was sort of lying on the floor in a fetal position, and they were trying to ask him a few questions, but he was being non-responsive. He'd appear to be in pain.
Pain. Was he conscious or unconscious?
He was conscious.
Okay.
As I was standing there, I was approached by somebody who tapped me on my shoulder, and I turned over and looked at them. It was a gentleman that I later came to know as Juan Medina.
Juan Medina.
Yes, sir.
He says, you can't cross here. It's a crime scene. And Juan says, hey, that's my cousin there. That's my cousin right there, brother. And then the officer says, okay, you know this person? He's like, yes. So then he brings us into, I would say, the crime scene. And I just see Mondo on the stretcher, and then he was lifeless. I didn't see any motion or nothing in him. And I don't know how we got separated. They separated us, and they put me into a cop car, and they said, we're gonna take you downtown for questioning. I need a statement from you.
Okay.
And that's when I ended up downtown.
The officers say that separating Jesse and Juan is standard protocol in a situation like this, in the off chance that either of them had anything to do with the shooting. Robert England died instantly from the gunshot wound to his head, and Armando Lasso later that night passed away from the wound to his abdomen. A group of 6 shell casings were found on the side of the road near to where Robert's body was located, and these were identified to have come from the same .22 caliber weapon. No other shell casings were found anywhere else on the scene. Despite initially suspecting that Jesse and Juan may have been involved, they are both cleared as suspects, and witness statements are taken from them. News of the shooting hits the media, and at the time it had made a lot of noise as gang violence had been at a high. With shootings being such a serious problem, residents were becoming concerned and frustrated with the abilities of the police to keep their community safe. People were scared, and it is said that law enforcement was under a lot of pressure to solve this shooting. A task which was going to prove to be rather difficult, as there was zero evidence left on the scene other than the shell casings. There was no DNA, no fingerprints, and no murder weapon. The casings were analysed and run alongside the police database for weapons used in crimes, but they unfortunately did not return any matches. The way things were going with the investigation, someone was about to get away with murder, when on April 21st, 1993, according to police, a 16-year-old boy named David Rangel enters an El Paso police department, and he tells them that he knows who did the shooting. His 16-year-old cousin, Daniel Villegas.
Back in April of 1993, did you tell the El Paso Police Department that the defendant told you that he committed the shooting?
Yes.
Okay.
From what I remember, what he told me was when we initially were speaking, we were just more of shooting the breeze, and then, we would talk about things because sometimes we knew people that may have been hurt. And so this particular conversation, I don't remember how exactly it came up, but then we started discussing it. He told me, guess who did it? And I don't know who. And then he said, well, guess. And I'm like, I have no idea. And so we kind of went back and forth a few times, and then he says, I did it.
Do you ask him or follow up why?
My memory serves correct, he recognized a couple of kids from Boomerangs.
From Boomerangs?
Correct.
What is Boomerangs?
Boomerangs back then was a movie theater, kind of like a teenage hangout in the Northeast.
Okay.
Daniel Villegas was known by friends and family to be quite an eccentric young man, one who had grown up in a tough neighborhood known as the Devil's Triangle. It is reported that he was never able to sit still in school and dropped out in 7th grade with a 3rd grade reading level. People recall that he glamorized life on the streets and would often hang out with members from the local gang VNE. Yet despite this, he had no criminal record and only one small run-in with the law for a curfew violation. Often Daniel tried to make his life sound more interesting than it was. He would brag to friends that he slept on a waterbed, that he was descended from Italian royalty, and that he owned a fancy stereo. Yet none of these things were true. The boy was described affectionately by his sister and mother as an exaggerator, and even at times a liar. His mother laughs as she calls him a pain in the butt. A psychiatrist who evaluated him in 1994 would testify that Daniel had a learning disability, ADHD, and a history of bragging. They would say that he suffered complex emotional problems and was very easily influenced, an individual who would be highly susceptible to coercion. His cousin David, who you just heard from, would sign a written statement outlining what Daniel had told him. Some of the important details contained within this statement are as follows. Daniel said he was riding in a black car with his friend Marcos Gonzalez and some other guys labeled as homeboys from the V&E gang. He himself was not driving, but as they were cruising around, they saw a group of boys walking. This was the 4 boys, Jesse, Juan, Robert, and Armando. Daniel says that he observed them throwing gang signs to one another, and as he continued to watch them, he recognized Armando Lasso. Daniel's group decides to circle around the block and come back to the boys who are walking. This time, as they park the vehicle, Daniel steps out wielding a gun and shoots at Armando. He says that he misses and hits the other boy next to him. The boy whom he struck fell and hit the ground immediately. Having missed his target, Daniel fires again, striking Mundo this time, who also falls to the ground. But Mundo very quickly gets up and begins to run. Worried that Mundo may recognize him and would identify him as the shooter, Daniel chases the injured boy down and shoots him as he's running away. After this, he jumps back in the car and the group speeds away. When asked by his cousin why he chose to shoot them, Daniel says that he doesn't know as he was too drugged up at the time. Based on this information and the interview of Rodney Williams, Daniel's friend who was 15 and who was believed to have been with Daniel at the time, Villegas and 18-year-old Marcos Gonzalez are quickly arrested. Both boys are interrogated at the same time in different rooms, and they both end up talking, Daniel eventually confessing to the shooting, with Marcos's story corroborating this. In Daniel's one-page written confession, at the end he writes, quote, "Give their families my regrets. I should not have done it, but I wanted to scare them." End quote. In December of 1994, Daniel goes to trial, and his family spend almost every cent that they have on a defense lawyer. Throughout this trial, the lawyer picks an enormous amount of holes in the state's case, many of which I will go over in detail later on in the video. But as a result of this, a significant amount of reasonable doubt is placed in the jury's minds about whether Daniel actually committed the shooting, or if he was nothing more than a silly teenager, not thinking things through and bragging about something that he never did. The deadlocked jury could not return a verdict, and with 11 finding him not guilty, 1 saying guilty, the trial resulted in a hung jury. A second date for court was scheduled, and in 1995, Daniel goes to trial again. This time though, his family, having had exhausted all of their money, could no longer afford an attorney, and Daniel is appointed a public defender. The result of this trial is much different than the first, and again, the details of what occurred here I will go over shortly, but this time the jury finds Daniel unanimously guilty. On August 24th, 1995, he is sentenced to life in prison, and this is where Daniel stays for the next 18.5 years. Throughout his time in prison, there would be one man on the outside who believed in Daniel's innocence so much so that he dedicated all of his energy towards fighting for this conviction to be overturned. A successful businessman named John Membella had married the former sister-in-law of Daniel Villegas, and he had adopted her 3 children. John would say, quote, "When we would take our daughters to visit their grandparents, which are Daniel's parents, I would hear them talk about a son who was in prison but was innocent. He had a life sentence, and I didn't pay a whole bunch of attention at first. I just figured, of course, no one wants to accept the fact that their son was in prison for murder. The old sarcastic saw stuck in my mind that everyone in prison is innocent. But one day, they were just very torn up. They were just crying. When I asked what's wrong, they said, 'Our son is never getting out of prison.' I felt so bad. I thought, let me see what I can do. I started looking into the case, and I became convinced that there was a very big possibility that Daniel was innocent." End quote. Membella hires a private investigator, a man who has over 40 years of experience as a homicide detective, and they begin to dig for information. In doing so, they unearth some of the many problems of the state's case, which were heavily scrutinized during Daniel's first trial. I'll go over a few of these problems now. In Daniel's confession, he says that he shot one of the boys in the back as he chased him down, yet autopsy reports show that both boys were hit front on. In addition to this, all of the shell casings found were in the same spot, consistent with a number of witness testimonies that all say they only heard one quick burst of 5 to 6 shots. Furthermore, in Marcos and Daniel's signed statements, they both say that the 2 of the boys who were supposedly in the car with them were boys by the nicknames Popeye and Droopy. It was proven that this is impossible, because on that night, one of those boys was incarcerated, and the other on house arrest, his parole officer confirming that the electronic tracking device listed the boy as never leaving the house that night. In Daniel's confession, he says that he and the group robbed a local service station before the shooting, yet investigation shows that this store reports no theft on that night. In addition to these discrepancies, further digging would uncover much more troubling information, potential serious police misconduct, and incredibly poor investigational work from the lead detective on the case, Alfonso Marquez. All of this information which I'm about to go through has been obtained from detailed and extensive court documents. There were well over 200 pages which I have gone through. I'll do my best to quote only the most notable details, but there will be links in the description of this video if anyone wishes to go over these documents in their entirety. 2 weeks before the shooting, 15-year-old Rudy Flores, an LML gang member who was known as Dust, had a confrontation with Robert England and Armando Lasso at a party, during which he threatened to kill Lasso and waited outside to fight him. Rudy's older brother, 20-year-old Javier Flores, was known as Dirt, also had confrontations with Armando Lasso and fought him at school. Rudy Flores had a car that was similar to the one described by the surviving victims. On April 10th, 1993, later in the evening, gunshots were reported on Shenandoah Street, in close proximity to the scene of the Electric Street shooting. Rudy Flores was present during the Shenandoah Street shooting. In addition, a .22 caliber weapon was recovered by police in connection with the Shenandoah Street shooting. This weapon was never tested against the .22 caliber casings recovered from the Electric Street shooting earlier that day. The recovered weapon was destroyed by the El Paso Police Department 5 years after it was taken into evidence. Rudy Flores drove past the same party the victims were at on Jamaica Street at approximately 11 p.m. on the night of the murder. At around midnight, Rudy Flores was in a car traveling east on Trans Mountain Road. Between 12:15 and 12:20 a.m., Rudy Flores was in the same car near Trans Mountain and Electric Street, the location of the shooting. Rudy Flores claimed he then went home. His home was located just 1 or 2 minutes away from the scene of the Electric Street shooting. This information placed Flores at the scene of the crime at the time of the shooting, which occurred shortly before the Gorhams called 911 at 12:18 a.m. At 4:25 p.m. on April 14, 1993, Javier Flores gave a statement to the police indicating that he lived with Rudy Flores, and when Javier arrived home at approximately 12:30 a.m. on the evening of the Electric Street shooting, Rudy was not home. Shortly after the shooting, Tonya Vinson, Terry Vinson, Charles Blucher, and Terence Farrar all contacted the police to alert them that they believed Rudy and or Javier Flores were responsible for shooting Lasso and England. For some reason, this lead involving Rudy Flores was poorly followed up by the detective, and seemingly nothing came from it. The eyebrow-raising issues don't end there either. Almost every person involved who found themselves in an interrogation room with Detective Marquez and his colleagues would eventually come forward to say that they were abused, verbally and physically, during questioning. The list of complaints is extensive, so once again, I'll do my best to only highlight a few. On April 12, 1993, Jesse Hernandez was brought back to the police station by Detective Marquez for further questioning, where the following occurred. Detective Marquez asked Hernandez to write out a description of the events leading up to and including the Electric Street shootings. While Hernandez was writing, Marquez took the statement, told him to just cut the bullshit, and threw the statement back at Hernandez. Detective Marquez accused Hernandez of killing his friends, and lied to him by telling Hernandez that Juan Medina had already implicated him. Detective Marquez threatened Hernandez that if he didn't confess, he would go to jail and get the death penalty. Detective Marquez accused Rangel of committing the murders, and lied to him that others had already implicated him in the shooting. Detective Marquez threatened Rangel with life in prison if he did not confess, and warned him that he was a pretty white boy with green eyes, who could expect to be fucked in prison. 15-year-old Williams was alone and without counsel during the 5 to 6 hour interrogation. He asked to see his mother, but Detective Graves refused these requests. Williams told Detective Graves that he and Villegas had been watching movies at the Village Green apartment complex on the night of the murders. Detective Graves threatened that, if Williams did not admit his involvement, he would be charged and go to jail. He told Williams that he would be raped so often and so brutally that his rectum would enlarge and he would not be able to fart. Williams signed a typed statement prepared by the officers, despite the fact that the information in the statement was untrue. Gonzalez testified that Detective Graves threatened to beat him if he did not confess to the Electric Street shooting. Detective Graves also promised to put Gonzalez in county jail, where he would be screwed by fat old men unless he confessed. Detective Graves promised Gonzalez that he was only interested in going after Villegas for the killings. Gonzalez testified that when he refused to confess, Detective Graves slammed him against the wall repeatedly. Villegas remained handcuffed to a chair while he was questioned for about an hour. Detective Marquez repeatedly accused Villegas of committing the Electric Street shooting, telling him that Rodney Williams had implicated him. Detective Marquez threatened Villegas that if he did not confess, he would be put in county jail to be raped and fucked by a bunch of fat, and I don't think it's too appropriate for me to say that word right now. Specifically, Detective Marquez threatened, "You are going to tell the judge that you are going to make a statement, and if you don't, you already know what I'm going to do to you, motherfucker. I'm going to take you to the desert and beat your ass." Furthermore, there was another 15-year-old boy who was questioned in relation to this case, and the details of this are as follows. Detectives Marquez and Graves interrogated Michael Johnston for 8 hours, from 7 p.m. on April 15 until 3 a.m. on April 16, 1993. Johnston was handcuffed during the entire 8 hours and was unaccompanied by his parents. Detective Marquez accused Johnston of shooting Lasso and England and lied to him that Johnston's friends had implicated him. Detective Marquez threatened Johnston with the electric chair if he did not confess, promising to pull the switch himself. Detective Marquez further threatened to take Johnston to jail, where he would be molested and raped if he did not confess, but he promised to let Johnston off easy if he did confess. Johnston confessed to shooting Armando Lasso and Robert England. Johnston was never charged with this offense. Detective Marquez later admitted that Johnston's confession was false. John Mimbella, the man spearheading this private investigation, did so at his own personal expense and would spend well over $200,000 fighting for Daniel's innocence. He had hired an experienced defense attorney, Joe Spencer, and in 2011, the fruits of their work had begun to sprout. A hearing was scheduled to look over the details and events which led to the shooting, and whether Daniel's guilty verdict was fair or not. During this hearing, Detective Marquez was grilled for 7 hours regarding his conduct and police work. Here are some of the quotes from the questioning between defense attorney Joe Spencer and Detective Marquez. "Did your investigation show that Rudy would terrorize people in his neighborhood?" asked Spencer. "No, sir. He was a prominent member of a gang," Marquez answered. "And what do prominent gangbangers do in their neighborhoods?" asked Spencer. "I don't know, sir," said Marquez. "In all of your experience as a detective, you're clueless about that?" Spencer asked. "I don't know, sir," said Marquez. "You don't know if you're clueless?" Spencer asked. "I don't know what they do, sir," responded Marquez. "Rudy told Armando he was going to get shot. Coincidence?" Spencer asked. "I don't know, sir," responded Marquez. "What did you do in your investigation?" "You don't remember?" Spencer asked. "I don't remember," said Marquez. "Try to put your good detective hat on," Spencer told Marquez. "I don't have one," responded the ex-detective. "I agree you don't have one," Spencer commented. Another person who was called to the stand during these hearings was a San Francisco law professor and expert on false confessions, Richard Leo. Leo said that he reviewed several statements given in the case, including Villegas' confession to police. Quote, "Villegas couldn't take the pressure of being told he had already been ratted out, threatened with homosexual rape and more. He was scared, and it is my opinion that's why he ended up giving the confession that he did." End quote. To further add weight to this argument of a false confession, this had been documented. Daniel Villegas recanted his confession to Monica Sotelo, a juvenile probation officer, as soon as he was away from Detective Marquez. Villegas told probation officer Sotelo that he didn't do it and that he only confessed because the cops were harassing him. Tired and wanting to go back to sleep, he told them what they wanted to hear. Another issue which was addressed during this hearing was Daniel receiving ineffective counsel for his second trial, therefore leading to an unfair verdict. Joe Spencer would highlight that in the lead-up to the second trial, Daniel's attorney had only 60 days to prepare, nowhere near enough time for a trial of this complexity. This attorney did not make any opening statements. He did not effectively cross-examine witnesses. He failed to put forward a proper argument, and did not highlight any discrepancies in the confessions and statements obtained. In regards to the testimony of Detective Marquez, Daniel's attorney at the time failed during cross-examination to bring up the 30 citizen complaints filed against him. He failed to pry into the numerous internal affairs investigations, which Marquez was the subject, failed to call a former prosecutor to the stand who had twice presented perjury charges against Marquez, and failed to question him about false confessions he had obtained in other cases, using tactics such as wearing a medical smock to fool the subject into believing that they were talking to medical personnel, not a detective. He would also fail to highlight Marquez's words that he had said to numerous people, quote, "I could have gotten anybody to confess to the Lasso and England murder if I wanted," end quote. Other witnesses Daniel's counsel would not present, which were used in the first trial, the mother of the baby that the teen was allegedly looking after that night, or the forensic psychiatrists who claimed that Daniel had a learning disability and was not only susceptible to police influence, but also very prone to lying and exaggerating. In comparison to the 18 witnesses presented from the defense in the first trial, the attorney from the second trial would call only one, a master sharpshooting expert, who testified that if it was indeed Daniel that did the shooting, the shots he made in the dark were near impossible for even a master marksman. When the state cross-examined this witness, they asked, although it would have been difficult for Daniel to make this shot, could it still be possible? To which the expert answered, yes, it is possible. In the closing statements from that trial, Daniel's attorney spent almost the entirety of it claiming that even if Villegas was the shooter, he never intended to hit the boys. He would have only wanted to scare them, firing in their direction to chase them away. Here is a quote from the state's closing arguments of the second trial. "Our case was here to be tested, and all we got was Everett Turner, the marksman. There isn't any evidence here that Daniel lacks the intelligence to make this confession, so don't go back there and say, well, he's just not smart enough. Think about it. Did you hear any evidence that he wasn't smart enough to make this statement? No one came in here and told you he was academically slow. No one told you that the words in that confession he signed were too big or too large, and he couldn't understand them. No one told you that. You can't argue back there, because that's not evidence. You would be guessing." At the end of this hearing in 2011, Judge Sam Medrano would overturn the conviction and ruled that a new trial would need to be scheduled. He said, quote, "The confession obtained by Detective Alfonso Marquez was coerced, and the court-appointed attorney who represented Villegas at trial was severely ineffective. For our justice system to work, it must make two important promises to its citizens: a fundamentally fair trial and an accurate result. If either of these two promises are not kept, our system loses its credibility, our citizens lose their faith and confidence in our court system, and eventually, our decisions and laws become meaningless." End quote.
A big change in the case against Daniel Villegas. A judge ruled today the murder confession Villegas gave when he was 16 years old cannot be used against him again. Our Maria Garcia has been breaking details on this case for more than 4 years.
Villegas was in prison nearly 20 years until the Court of Criminal Appeals threw out his conviction. But the DA is still trying to prove he's guilty.
Today's probably the biggest day in Daniel's life. For the first time in 21 years, somebody finally believes Daniel.
The judge ruling the testimony of Marquez and another former police detective were not credible. The DA's office saying they respectfully disagree with the judge and are moving forward with the case. And Villegas has told us he's bracing himself for a possible third trial.
I mean, that's pretty nerve-wracking.
In January of 2014, after nearly 19 years in prison, Daniel would be let out on bond, whilst a new trial date was to be scheduled. Leading up to the third trial, which occurred in 2018, legal battles still fiercely raged on. Whilst the defense was able to get the confession suppressed, the state would try to get admitted into evidence prison phone calls between Daniel and people in his family, namely his mother Yolanda and John Mimbella. The state argues that these calls prove his guilt, and show that John Mimbella was actively trying to bribe witnesses. There are 37 phone calls in total, so again, for timeliness' sake, I'll only highlight a few. On March 14, 2011, Daniel would speak to his mother regarding the upcoming proceedings. The conversation led towards the fact that this would be his last chance at ever being free, and near the end of the conversation, this is what was said. Villegas. Yup, ain't nothing else you can do after this. That's a done deal. Yolanda. Are you sure? Villegas. Yup. I lost all the... Only thing. You can go into the federal courts. You have to have actual innocence, man. And we don't got that. Daniel would argue that what he referred to as actual innocence is the legal standard of the word, and wasn't talking about the morality of his situation, whereas the state would say that this is a clear admission of guilt. There are a number of other examples where Daniel refers to himself as a sinner and that he is not innocent, but Daniel says that these statements have been taken out of context, and when looked at it within the entire conversation, he was referring to his life in general, that he has done wrong in his time overall, and wasn't specifically talking about the shooting. John Mimbella is accused of witness tampering, and here are some examples of what the state would say is clear indication of this. Mimbella. We tried talking to Robert Williams today again, but nah, he keeps saying that you were still bragging about it. Villegas. He's lying. Mimbella. We're not going to use him. Mimbella. I'm going to send you the picture of Jesse at the football game. He sat there with us and we talked a lot. He never been to a football game. Mimbella. I got a hold of that Robert Williams again, and I'm going to interview him for a job tomorrow. I'm going to hire him so I can have him close to me, and I get all kinds of information from him. I already have Juan Medina on payroll. Mimbella disputes these claims and says that because he has spent so much of his life on this case, he has gotten to know these people like Jesse Hernandez and Juan Medina. At times they needed jobs and he needed staff. There were a set of phone calls, which I'll highlight on screen now, that the state puts forward to show John trying to get in touch with Rudy Flores. Rudy is in prison serving a 20-year sentence for drug charges, and Mimbella is seen on multiple occasions talking about this. He had already posted a $50,000 reward for anyone who had information on the case, and he exclusively offers it to the Flores family in case they knew if Rudy was involved. All of these phone calls were ultimately ruled not admissible as evidence, and on October 1st, 2018, Daniel Villegas would be scheduled to go to trial one more time.
Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, good morning. April 10th, 1993, Armando Lasso and Robert England were murdered in Northeast El Paso. There's no question about that. We know that 2 weeks before the murder, Rudy Flores threatens Armando Lasso. He tells him, I'm going to kill you. 1 week before the murder, the Flores brothers, both of them, threaten Armando Lasso again at school. Immediate suspect, Rudy Flores. After the shooting, when Rudy Flores talks to the detective, I saw some boys outside on Jamaica Street when I drove by, and they just kind of stared at me. He didn't say they mad dogged me, but he said they just kind of stared at me. But I ignored him and drove right by. Rudy Flores places himself at the scene of the crime at 12:18, in his own words. When I drove by there was no lights, no sirens, and I didn't see anything. Well, what time did you drive by there? And Rudy Flores' own words said between 12:15 and 12:20. He puts himself at the scene, opportunity, at the time that the offense occurred. Less than 24 hours later, less than a quarter mile away, Rudy Flores is present in another shooting. He's a one-man terror, terrorizing that community. The two surviving victims, Jesse Hernandez and Juan Medina, you will hear, they were accused by Detective Al Marquez of committing a murder.
He took me to a room, I believe he would say an interrogation room, because I can remember there was a window that looked like a mirror and a table with a couple of chairs.
He took you in an interrogation room?
Yes, sir.
Accused you of killing those boys?
Yes, sir.
Were you scared?
I was scared and confused at the same time.
Did you tell him that you didn't do it?
I said, how could you say that? I said, how could you say that, sir? And he says, your friend Juan saying you did it. You have every motive to do it. You have Bobby's ring. You have his beeper. For all we know, you even wanted his girlfriend, and you wanted him dead. And I just couldn't fathom that he would say that, or even Juan would say that. And he said, well, you know what? You're going to have to explain it to the judge because they're going to fry your ass. And he walked out, and I just put my head down, and I couldn't believe what I was hearing. And I was already thinking, how did I do it? I was already imagining that I did it. But then I said, how did I get the gun? Where did I get the gun? And I just kind of like, I was not there in the moment anymore.
How old were you, Jesse?
I was 17.
Did you come close to confessing?
If he pushed a little longer, yeah. All I wanted to do was just leave that room and go home. He gave me when everything started, he gave me a notepad and he says, I need you to give me detail, word for word, exactly what had happened. And I wrote it on a legal notepad, a yellow legal notepad. And he grabs it and he starts reading it. And he tosses it at me. He says, let's cut the bullshit. You know it and I know it, you're lying. So why don't you just confess and say you did it? It's because your friend's saying you did it. For my friend Juan to say that, I was like, why would he say that? What was his motive? What was the reason for him to say that? He has to be true.
Did you shoot your friends, Jesse?
No, sir. No.
He's a victim. He's victimized. His two friends were killed. Jesse Hernandez came this close to admitting to something he didn't do. How vulnerable is a 16-year-old boy in the hands of an experienced homicide detective who's telling you, your friend already told me you did it, so just admit it. Or you're going to go to jail for the rest of your life? You're going to get the electric chair? The prosecutor likes to tell you that David Angel, his cousin, after he spoke with Daniel, thought it was his duty and he called the police. He said, I got to turn in my cousin. That's not what happened. David Angel, you're going to hear from him. What the evidence is going to show is that the detectives were under a lot of pressure to solve this case. So they started looking around for different suspects. And they found that David Angel had a charge pending against him for telephone harassment. So they call looking for David Angel.
My mom says, call the detectives, take care of it. And so I immediately did it so I wouldn't be in trouble, so to speak. So what they told me was, if you come, you're just going to sign a few documents, we'll release you. It was more of like, they made it seem it was more of like a matter of formality. So they picked me up, and from the substation in the Northeast, they start taking me to the one in 5 Points.
The Crimes Against Person, the CAP office.
Whatever that may be.
Okay.
So that's where they took me. And so now I'm getting a little nervous because I'm like, it seems more than just harassment charges. So I asked him kind of nervously, is there something going on? Am I in trouble? And he's like, oh yeah, you're in trouble. And he didn't want to tell me what was going on. So that car ride was really long for me. So we get there and I asked him what's going on. He says that he knows someone that says that I'm guilty of capital murder. So he starts saying that I'm guilty of it. And at that point, I don't know what he's talking about. I'm like, what are you talking about? He's like, oh, we know you did it. And I'm like, did what? We know you killed those boys. And, sorry, it is tough. And then so I asked him, I go, are you talking about the story my cousin told me? And he's like, yeah, tell me that. Tell me the story your cousin told me.
This statement that David gave to police would be the state's biggest piece of evidence against Daniel, and on direct examination, the prosecutor questions Mr. Rangel extensively regarding the details of it.
What you told the detectives in the statement, were you telling the truth then?
Correct.
Okay. Does he tell you who exactly did the shooting?
He said he did.
Okay. Did you ask him if anybody else shot?
He said he was the only one who shot.
Okay. Tell me how he explains the shooting to you, Mr. Rangel.
How he explained it was, I guess when he recognized the people when they came back around, he stepped outside of the car and he blasted them with a shotgun.
So he meant to shoot Mondo, but hit the guy right next to him.
Yes.
Yes? So then what does he tell you he does at that point?
He shot again.
And when he shot again, what happened? Does he hit Mondo that time?
He said that he saw Mondo go down.
All right. And after Mondo goes down, what does the defendant tell you happens next?
From my memory, I remember he said that he didn't go down, and so he chased him and blasted him with a shotgun afterward.
When this statement is typed, it says that the defendant was not specific about the type of gun used. Are you following me here in your statement?
Yes.
I have been asked if I know what kind of gun or weapon was used in the killing, and I don't know. This statement's saying he did not tell you what kind of gun was used. Is that correct?
The statement is saying
This
that.
statement says that.
Correct.
And it says, I'm asked about it, and I don't know what kind of gun or weapon was used in the killing.
That's what it says.
That's what this statement
That's
says.
what the statement says.
Okay.
When I mentioned the shotgun several times to Marcus, Marcus didn't like that answer. So he kept yelling at me, saying, no, that's not correct. That's not correct. So I didn't know what he needed and what he wanted for me to say.
Okay. Talk to me about how that first statement happened.
How this first statement, well,
yes.
this would technically be my second statement.
Okay.
There was another statement that I filled out that Detective Marcus didn't agree with, so he threw away.
Okay.
When Detective Marcus threw away the first statement, what did he tell you?
He said it's not correct. He didn't like the fact that the shotgun was in there. That was the biggest out of all of it. That was the biggest one that he did not like in the statement.
In the handwritten statement, there is nothing about a shotgun. Would you agree with me on that statement?
Yeah, Mr. Marcus told me to omit it.
Just listen to my question. I'm going to let you tell, I promise. Would you agree with me that there's nothing about a shotgun in this statement?
Yes.
Okay. And would you agree with me that in your typewritten statement, above where you sign, it says he was not specific about the gun that was used. I have been asked if I know what kind of gun or weapon was used in the killing, and I don't know. That is contained in this statement.
That's what Marcus put in there.
Okay. And you're saying that this was the truth, what you were telling the detectives back then?
Correct.
Okay.
But you're also telling them that he was joking, and you told the detectives he was joking, and you told them that over and over again, correct?
Yes, but he didn't want to hear it. Detective Marcus pretty much told me that, he didn't want to hear what I had to say in regards to that.
You never went back to a police department to clear up any of this? The answer is no.
Correct.
Never
I don't
came.
remember that.
Okay. Never came to the DA's office to talk to anyone with the DA's office to clear up any of this?
No.
The first time that we hear about this is when you're given an opportunity to talk about it in December of 1994 after you've met with your cousin's lawyer. Is that correct?
I believe so. Well, from your standpoint,
That we hear about
that you
this?
hear about it, yes, because Marcus omitted it.
Okay. And at that time, in December of 1994, you're even living with the defendant. Is that correct?
Correct, if I remember correctly.
The prosecutor asked you, why didn't you go back to the police department, the same police department, to the same detective that threatened you with capital murder? Did you trust Detective Marcus?
No.
Did you think if you went and told Detective Marcus, he'd say, okay, let me correct Your statement for you, David Rangel, did you think you would do that?
No.
So on April 21st of 1993, the same day that you gave this information to the police, your cousin is arrested. And after he's arrested, I can only assume, but I want you to tell me the reaction that is had by his family when they find out that it was your information that led to his arrest. How did his family react to that?
I wasn't there when the family reacted.
In general, this is as even up to today. Let's talk about 1993.
That's speculation, Your Honor.
Back in 1993, how did his family react? Your aunt, it's your mom's sister. How did they react when they found out that you had given this information to the police?
I wasn't there when that was found out, but we were still together afterwards, so again, I couldn't tell you.
Okay. You were not treated any differently by his family or by him when they found out that it was your information that led to his arrest?
No, we would still hang out together afterward.
I want to make sure, because I find this incredulous, I want to make sure that you're telling this jury that there was no reaction by his family, by his mother, your aunt, when they found out that he was arrested based on the information that you gave to the El Paso Police Department.
There may have been a reaction, but I wasn't there, so I couldn't tell you what the reaction was.
I'm not asking you the day he was arrested. I'm telling you in general at that time frame. How did they react to knowing this, finding out about this?
Well, again, like I'm telling you, we were still together afterward.
So they loved you and hugged you and embraced you and thanked you.
I'm going to object. Argumentative.
You're going to tell this jury there was no reaction.
I couldn't say that if there was no reaction, but again, I'm telling you, our family's pretty tight, so we were still with each other after the fact.
What was their reaction when they found out that you gave this information to the police department?
I wasn't there. I don't know.
I'm not saying that day. In the time that progressed.
Ask an answer and argumentative.
Yes, the answer is sustained.
Okay.
The state had tried to get evidence introduced that shows the family's frustration with David for being the cause of the arrest, and I believe this line of questioning was intended to highlight that to the jury. Additional testimony was meant to come from another witness for the state that was going to place a .22 caliber gun in Daniel's possession at around the time of the shooting. But when it came to his turn to be called, this witness invoked the Fifth Amendment and would not answer any questions, much to the frustration of the prosecutor. They would then call Angelica Hernandez to the stand. This woman says that a few days after the shooting, back in April of 1993, when she was 15 years of age, she was at a mall with a friend, and they were on their way to go see a movie. A group of 3 boys whom she had never met or seen before, all looking around their age, approached them. The boys started conversation, and Angelica recalls one of them being much more talkative than the other 2. He would ask the 2 girls what they were up to at the mall, and if they have boyfriends. But quickly, the topic turned to the shooting that had happened a few days prior. This talkative boy bragged that he was the one responsible for the shooting, and this scared Angelica, prompting her to cut the interaction short. Angelica never came forward with this information until a couple of months before this 2018 trial, and her reason for this was that the day after she had this interaction, she saw on the news that the shooter had been arrested, and it was in fact the boy who was speaking with her, Daniel Villegas. So she figured, seeing as they got him, it was all taken care of, and she didn't need to bring this information forward. When she saw that he was going to trial again in the year 2018, she decided to approach the DA with this information. The state would present no detectives who were involved with this investigation. But what the state did present were a number of individuals who were all involved in the logistics of the investigation in some way. During their testimonies, they outlined the work which they put into the case, and as expected, it would not go without scrutiny from the defense. Joe Spencer, during opening statements, would say, quote, "The prosecutor tells you that they followed all the leads, that they found all the evidence, but did they really?" End quote.
This house, the front yard points in this direction here, is that correct?
I don't know.
No, sir. You just were oblivious to any part of that side of the street?
Correct, sir.
And you know that there was 2 people that were shot, correct?
Yes.
And I think you told the ladies and gentlemen of the jury, since you never went anywhere over by the house, you didn't look for any blood trails or look for any blood or anything like that. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
You never went anywhere near that portion of the house?
Correct, yes.
You never went to examine to see if there was any forensic evidence or any other evidence that has any evidentiary value of that part of the home?
Correct.
Did you know that there was a victim that was laying in front of that home?
No, sir.
How long were you at the crime scene?
I would say approximately maybe 3-4 hours.
By the time you arrived, had the bodies already been removed?
One body was still there.
Were you told, or did you become familiar where that person was before he was taken to the hospital?
No, sir.
Did you care?
I cared, I just didn't get that information.
You did tell us a little while ago, you told ladies and gentlemen of the jury that you went looking for evidence and you actually found, you're the one that actually found the shell casings, correct?
Yes, sir.
Is it fair to say that you also looked to see if there was any other evidence in the area where Armando Lazo was? Would that be logical?
I don't believe I had anything to do with that immediate area as far as looking for evidence was. I didn't do anything there.
Okay, you don't, I'm sorry, say that again?
As far as like continuing to look for evidence,
Yes.
where Mr. Lazo was lying,
Right.
I didn't do that.
You didn't do that?
No, sir.
All right. I notice in your report that you indicated that you had actually taken photographs, maybe 20 or so, that were taken, that did not come out in this case due to a malfunction in the camera and a malfunction in the flash. Is that correct?
There were some photographs that weren't able to be preserved
Okay.
or weren't as good as some other ones.
In your report here, you make reference to the photographs taken of the autopsy, and you say the photos in this case did not come out, correct?
Yes, sir, that's what it said.
Right, that's what it says, correct?
Okay, correct.
And when you, as an officer at the academy, they teach you how it's important to document all the information that you get, correct?
Yes, sir.
And to document it accurately, correct?
Yes, sir.
So when you put in your report 25 years ago that the photographs did not come out, you're telling ladies and gentlemen of the jury today that some of them came out, correct?
Yes, sir.
But that wasn't what you memorialized and you put with your signature on, correct?
Yes, sir.
Is it true that the Texas Forensic Science Commission has investigated your department for deliberately falsifying results?
Not the firearm section, no.
That's not my question. The Texas Forensic Science Commission has investigated your department for deliberately falsifying results, yes or no?
They have reviewed, the Texas Department of Public Safety has been reviewed under the Forensic Science Commission, yes. There was not for firearms analysis.
That's not my question.
Yes.
In fact, the investigation that was done actually led to the firing of an employee, is that fair?
Judge, I'm going to object if it has nothing to do with the firearm.
I'm asking about an employee that worked with the department that was terminated as a result of falsifying reports.
Sustained.
Was anybody from your department fired?
My
No.
objection is relevant.
Sustained. He answered.
They left the department voluntarily.
Sir.
Okay.
Okay, let me help you out.
The state had also presented a medical examiner who was not the one that actually performed the autopsies, but instead, he does hold a wealth of experience. Dr. Contin would testify to their injuries after studying the autopsy reports.
So you've been, throughout the last few years, you were chief medical examiner, deputy medical examiner,
Yes.
back to temporary chief medical examiner,
Yes.
and now you're back to deputy.
Yes.
So you tried to retire a couple times in this process?
Well, I should maybe.
But we won't let you, will we, Dr. Contin?
But
We won't let you.
no.
Okay. I want to start with Armando Lazo. The trajectory of this particular bullet is from the inside of the thigh going up and exiting basically the back of his leg. If an individual has a bullet wound that's going up, Where would the gun have to be?
If it is standing, the other person had to be at a lower level for the bullet to go up.
Okay.
Unless the person
standing.
doing the shooting is low in the lower position, they're looking at him from behind. I mean, you can never tell the position of the assailant, the victim.
So this is his lethal bullet wound, is that
Yes,
correct?
That's correct.
Could an individual who have received this gunshot first, would that individual be able to continue to run or try to get away?
Yes.
Okay, so this isn't a gunshot wound that's going to drop him in the spot where he was hit?
No.
Okay.
You are able to walk home with a kind of bullet wound.
Okay. And the one to his leg is not lethal? This would not have killed him?
No.
Okay.
It's non-fatal.
You have a copy of the autopsy report of Robert England and Armando Lasso?
Yes.
And that's what you've been using to testify from today, is that correct?
Yes.
May I approach the witness, Your Honor?
Yes, sir.
This is the first homicide case I've ever had that stated not introduce the autopsy report, so I'm going to do that for the jury.
Judge, I'm not allowed by law to introduce it because he didn't author it.
Well, this is,
May I approach witness, ma'am?
yes, sir.
Let me show you what I've marked as Defendant's Exhibit Number 2 and Defendant's Exhibit Number 3. Did you say with respect to Armando Lasso that the entrance wound was on the rear to the front?
In the back of the left side,
In the back of the left thigh?
about 4.5 inches above the knee.
Okay. Defendant's Exhibit Number 3, which is part of Armando Lasso's autopsy report, it says bullet entry wound, correct?
Yes.
And it's got it on the front of his thigh, correct?
Yes.
And this is the
Well,
back?
not in front. It was in the medial, I mean, in the center. You could only see it from the back.
Okay. And this is the back of Armando Lasso, correct?
Yes.
And it says bullet exit, is that correct? And it points to where the bullet exit is?
Yes.
So I'm a little confused because what the drawing shows where the entrance and exit is different from what you've testified to the jury is, isn't it?
No, the bullet entered in the inside of the left side and went upwards and left. It's still left in the back of the thigh because the bullet traveled inside the body maybe 3 inches.
Okay. But what this drawing shows is the exit of the bullet wound that appears to be the back of his thigh. Is that fair?
That's correct.
Less than 3 hours after the Electric Street shooting, 2.5 miles away, another shots fired 911 call is placed. I know I have already mentioned the second shooting, which involved Rudy Flores, and to ensure that details do not become confused, this is not that one, but a third event which occurred that night. This report of shots fired came in right at the location where Daniel Villegas was living, and when the responding officer arrived at around 3 a.m., he spots Daniel, Marcos Gonzalez, and Rodney Williams all hanging around outside on the street. The officer testifies that the boys are being rather evasive with his questions, but ultimately he finds no reason to be suspicious of them and orders Daniel and Marcos to go inside where they lived together whilst he drove Rodney home. There would be one more crucial witness for the state, a friend of Daniel's whose name is Oscar Gomez. A few months after the shooting, Daniel would be released on bond, and during this time he meets up with Oscar for a hangout. Whilst they are sitting around and smoking cigarettes, Oscar says that they discuss the murders, and he asks Daniel if his friend had actually done the shooting. You'll see in a moment what he testifies that Daniel said to him, but the interesting detail here is that Mr. Gomez didn't report this conversation to authorities at the time. It's not until 2014, 10 years later, where he is picked up by police for a warrant relating to traffic tickets, that he decides to say anything.
First they told me that I was arrested because of my traffic warrants, that they were looking for me. And then when I got to the substation in Central, they had told me, well, you know something, you know what this is about? And I told them that I didn't. And then, well, this is about Danny Villegas case, and we know that you know something.
Okay. And you ended up telling them what?
That about me and Danny had a conversation about it.
And what else did you tell them?
That he had said that he did it.
Okay. Were you aware that you were being recorded?
And you asked him about the shooting? You asked him about the murder? Or
Yes.
What happened? What was that conversation?
Yes, I did ask him if he did it.
If he did what?
If he did the shooting. And he said, yeah. He grinned and said, yeah. And I just told him that, no, that's fucked up.
And so, sir, in 2014, when you were interviewed by Detective Sanchez, you told him that the defendant told you, yeah, he did do the shooting.
Yes, sir, I told him.
Okay. And you said that he had grinned.
Yes, sir, that's what he wanted to hear.
That's what, who wanted to hear?
The detective.
The detective, okay. So you're saying that he made you say that?
Yes.
How do you think the detectives knew that you had this conversation with Dan?
Objection, speculation.
Sir, answer only if you have personal knowledge. If you don't know how they found out, your answer is, I don't know. If you know how they found out, please answer the
I
question.
didn't know how they found out at first.
Okay. What did you tell your niece?
That I'm not sure if he's guilty. And she probably turned it around.
I see. And so the detectives just came and plucked you out of thin air, and they knew that you had had this conversation.
Object argumentative, Your Honor.
Yes, because it was a long time ago, and I didn't remember who I told.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Mr. Gomez.
I didn't.
All right.
Mr. Gomez, before the recording started, you were in handcuffs, is that correct?
Yes, sir.
Right, okay. And then when you told Detective Sanchez that you don't remember, that Daniel didn't tell you anything, no admissions, he told you, no, I'm going to make you remember. Isn't that correct?
Yes, sir.
And then after a lengthy interrogation by Detective Sanchez, when you weren't being recorded, he tells you, I'm going to record you. And if you say anything different from what I want you to say, you're going to jail.
Yes, for my warrants.
That's what he told you, didn't he?
Yes.
Okay. And you told him, look, I'm going to tell you the truth. I don't think he committed the murders. You told him that, didn't you?
Yes.
And I don't think he made any admissions to me. You told him that, too.
Yes.
When you weren't being recorded, correct?
Yes.
Okay. And the detective said, as long as you help me out, I'm going to let you go. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
And then he told you, and don't you talk to the defense lawyers. Is that what the detective
Yes,
told you?
sir. Don't talk to anyone.
All right.
Before closing arguments would commence, the defense would ask the judge for a directed verdict. This is based on lack of evidence presented by the state.
Not one scintilla of evidence has been presented. It's extraordinary that even the state itself has failed to call even one of its case detectives, even one of its law enforcement detectives. Not a single one. There's not one piece of physical evidence that links any of the allegations to Mr. Villegas. Not a single piece. In fact, all of their strongest witnesses have retracted all their statements. Every single one. All the rest of the testimony can't even be considered evidence. It's based on secondhand data. It's based on corrupted memory. It's based on pure gossip. And this is a court of law, not a court of gossip.
This isn't gossip. This isn't secondhand hearsay. These are statements that have been made by the accused. This isn't hearsay that was somehow allowed in despite your gatekeeping abilities. These are statements by the accused that we're asking to let a jury in El Paso to decide if what they originally said was true or what they want to say now on the stand after they've been influenced or encouraged to say otherwise. You know as well as I do, Judge, that this happens every day in a court of law where a witness has said one thing and wants to come back later and say something different. And it's the jury to decide the credibility of that witness and whether they were telling the truth then or in the courtroom.
The defendant's motion for directed verdict is denied.
After 3 days of testimony, having presented their cases, both sides give their closing arguments.
David Rangel testified that the police called me wanting to talk to me about my telephone harassment. They wanted to talk to me about my case. That's what they told me. And that I showed up at the police station, and all of a sudden they started questioning me about the murder. They started accusing me of doing the murder. But how would the police know to look for David Rangel? That he had information relevant to this case? How would they know that? He doesn't want to admit, I came forward to the police. What are the police going to do? Pick up every single person wanted in El Paso on a misdemeanor telephone harassment and bring them all in and say, we know you did have information about the shooting. We know you have information about the shooting. We know you have information about the shooting. It doesn't make sense. Why would the police pick David Ronhell out of all the people in El Paso County? How would they get so lucky to know that he had information incriminating Daniel Villegas?
And you see this entire audience room, it was pointed out to you, these are the defendant's family and loved ones and their crime. Think about the pressure on David Ronhell. We are here because he told the truth initially. That is why we are here. And then there's this. He says, well, it's because they threatened me. Which makes no sense either. It makes no sense. Out of thin air, they pluck this kid out of the lower valley, bring him to their office and say, we know you did it. We know you did this capital murder that we're investigating in the Northeast. Okay, fine. We know you didn't do it, but we know that you know who did it. And if this is really some evil conspiracy, because that's what it has to be for you to go along with the defense theory. Evil. Downright evil. If it truly is that evil conspiracy, then why not write, my cousin told me it was a .22. They know what it is. They're investigating the scene. They know from the very beginning it's .22 casings. Why not put that in there? If it's as evil as they make it out to be. Put it in there. And then case closed. But he says, I don't know. He didn't tell me about the gun. And then a year and a half later, he has to say, because of this, they found me, I didn't come forward, they threatened me, and I told him it was a shotgun. Does that make sense? Let's look at the second confession in this case, Oscar Gomez. This is not in 1993 anymore. This is now in 2014. Now there's another dirty, evil detective, right? So a new evil detective in 2014, a Detective Roy Sanchez, different from the evil detective back in 1993. A new one continues to threaten these witnesses in a conspiracy to get Daniel Villegas, find the defendant guilty based on his confessions that he has made to people who know him and who believed him.
You think about those of you that have a 16-year-old grandson. You think about in the hands of a detective what they could do. Because they don't have any lead. They're desperate. You heard the evidence. A lot of shootings, big homicide rate, bad gang problems back then, what he talked about. They had pressure to solve it. No physical evidence, no forensic evidence, no scientific evidence, no identification, no eyewitness testimony, no eyewitness identification. They didn't have anything. So when you don't have any evidence, what do? You get somebody to confess. And they just kept going down the line. You got to get somebody to confess. You know, we get accused, defense lawyers, of smoke and mirrors. Where's been the smoke and where's been the mirrors? You've been in this courtroom. You've seen it. In fact, they didn't call one detective. Think about that. Capital murder case. Now, one detective was called. We don't have an obligation. We don't have a burden. It's not our job to prove it to them. But those boys named every detective that abused them. And that's the evidence you have. And now, one of those detectives was man enough to show up and try to defend themselves. It's offensive. And it's dangerous. And if it happens to one of your children or one of your loved ones, you can feel like Daniel and Daniel's family. I have to tell you something. If during the course of representing Daniel, If I have said or done anything to offend you, I apologize for offending you. I make no apology for representing Daniel. It has been a privilege to represent that young man. Because I have seen that this is not a case of human error. This has been a case of human manipulation by the members of the constabulary. And because their ego is so big, and they will never accept that they made a mistake and that they got it wrong, that they want you to bail them out. Because they're not big enough to say, we made a mistake. We should have followed the evidence. No matter what they've tried to tell you what the evidence does and has shown, it has not. It has not. Don't do for them what the evidence has failed to do. Daniel's been waiting more than 25 years for justice. Try not to keep him waiting any longer. Godspeed with your verdict.
We're back on the record in cause number 94-0D09328, State of Texas versus Daniel Villegas. The record should reflect the attorneys for the state, the attorneys for the accused. The accused are present in the courtroom. The court has received a message from the jury indicating that they've reached a verdict. Pete, let's bring the jury in. Please be seated. The attorneys for the state, the attorneys for the accused are present in the courtroom. The court has brought the jury back into the courtroom, having received a message that they've reached a verdict. Madam Presiding Juror, has in fact reached a verdict. Could you please hand the charge and the verdict form to the bailiff? The court does find that the verdict is in proper form. If the defendant will please stand. In the District Court of El Paso County, Texas, 409th Judicial District, the State of Texas versus Daniel Villegas, number 94-0D09328. Verdict Form B. We, the jury, find the defendant Daniel Villegas not guilty of Ladies and gentlemen, is this your verdict? And is it a unanimous verdict? Does anybody wish to have the jury polled? There has been a request that the jury be polled so that I can ensure that it is your individual verdict.
It is at this point of the video where I would like to make a note that I'm no longer presenting research and testimony, and now speak from my own personal thoughts and feelings. What a journey looking into this case has been, spanning 3 trials over 2.5 decades. There was quite a lot to get through. I think out of all of the videos that I've worked on, this unexpectedly would be the one that I've dived the deepest into. When I had first learned about it and looked into the trial footage, I thought to myself that it would be a relatively quick one to put together. With only 11 hours of total trial footage, that was a mere fraction compared to some other cases I've worked on. Yet the further I dug into it, the more a dwelling iceberg would reveal itself. I had found myself thinking about this case before I fell asleep. Then again as I woke, questions emerged such as, how might I present it in a video? And where do I even stand on the proceedings as a whole? At times I found myself fluctuating. The state's evidence was weak, but I did wonder whether Daniel could have been that kid trying to impress local gangbangers and had done this shooting as a way to prove himself on the streets. These thoughts didn't last too long when they came up, and after it was all finished, I did find my personal opinion resting with the defense, and with the relief that comes from knowing an innocent man is out of prison, came a strange sense of, I don't really know how to feel. like reading a gripping novel that has come to its inevitable close. When the final page turns, all of the characters that I've come to know close with it. Their struggles and plight, victories and triumphs, tragedies and lessons, they all close with that final page, and I must step back into my everyday life, remembering them for what they experienced. Finishing a good book is a jarring experience, that's for sure, and the story of Daniel's journey to exoneration has felt this way for me. I can't begin to imagine how John Mambella must have felt at the conclusion of it all, after battling so fiercely for so long. In an interview, he recalls those first moments when he had reached out to Daniel in prison.
He said he literally got down on his knees and prayed and said, God, show me a sign that I'm not going to spend the rest of my life. And he says that the next day he got my letter. So, that's why I'm fighting so hard for him. And I promised him that, I wasn't going to stop till he got out.
After those powerful waves of triumph had calmed, what does he feel then? He had dedicated so much of his life to this cause, and it now having an end, I wonder what he felt. I looked into John a bit more, and it seems that his inspiration to fight for justice is not over. He's a prominent member on the board of directors for Proclaim Justice, a non-profit organization set up with the cause of winning freedom for wrongful convictions. I mentioned that I found the people in this case to be rather memorable, and I'll explain why. Take Jesse Hernandez as an example. I can see a scenario where one may originally look at this case and see him as nothing more than another witness. Not much more thought or attention going toward him, as that is his role here. With the key focus being on Villegas, Jesse is in the shadows as just the man who observed the crime. His testimony being used by both sides of the argument to paint a bigger picture, a picture that we as onlookers are meant to understand, to study and to analyze. But in doing this, it's easy to overlook the reality of where this testimony comes from, a human being. Upon watching him on the stand, the way he speaks and holds himself I found to be engrossing and harrowing. I wasn't watching a 40-year-old man, but that of a scared 16-year-old boy who would buckle and flinch ever so slightly as he was asked to recall the incidents that have severely traumatized him. He does say that he doesn't like talking or thinking about these events, because when he does, he gets brought back to being the scared young boy who felt powerless. This is reality for him, something that he lives with day to day, someone who must get on with his life, owning the scars of April 1993, which have been carved into the pages of his history. He must go to work, or start a family, or do whatever it is that he's doing, but must do so whilst pretending like life isn't a confusing whirlwind of profound emotion. He, like many of us, have our own traumas and problems that we face day to day, and must deal with as best we can whilst making as little fuss as possible. Jesse experienced, he testified, and he now must sink back into the world to keep on keeping on, something that I'm certain we all do to some degree or another, and that's why I found him to be so deeply relatable, memorable. I'm well aware that I'm making assumptions about who he is as a person. All I know about him really is what I saw on the stand, and I won't shy away from that fact. I also don't want you to think that I'm trying to make him out to be a saint or a great guy. I really don't know who he is. What I'm saying is, it's that lack of knowledge about who he is, which really allows for one to attach a sense of relatability to what I saw of him. And that most definitely happened here for me.
He left me with some nightmares. I'm a grown man, but I can see how Daniel was forced into a confession.
Speaking of people that didn't get much of a focus in this case, let's take a look at, in my opinion, an underlooked element of tragedy that was not present in the video I had made. Other than the obvious, a man who has been ruled as innocent, spending most of his life behind bars. What ate away at me was the lack of attention given to Mando and Bobby. Nowhere in any of the hundreds of pages of court documents, hours of testimony, and countless articles could I find information about who they were. This isn't anything abnormal, I suppose. It was the early 90s, and cell phones weren't really a thing. Yet even now, in the age of limitless connection, people come and people go without ever really leaving much of a footprint. Prior to making this channel, I, much like many of you I'm certain, was comfortable in the thought that I wouldn't make much of a footprint on the world. This is by no means a negative thought either. There's a certain sense of calm to it, peace in knowing that my little experience with life is like a small gift for me to share with myself. I found that thought to be quite pleasant, and even now, after making videos and gathering people such as yourself who enjoy watching, more people than I could have ever imagined actually, I still feel the same way, that there is a sense of calm and peace to one's life, not being on display for the world to see. The idea that we are all people who find themselves one day lucid and in control of a body, and as we grow we do a bunch of things without many others knowing or watching, and then we depart from the world, without barely leaving a trace. This is an idea that I very much relate to, and it's this thought that I find most potent in regards to the lack of info I could dig up on both Bobby and Mando. This void of nothing that separates who they were and what I know of them is what makes me feel deeply connected to two people whom I will never meet. Some may look at these boys and say, well, rough neighborhood, rough mindsets, they were going nowhere, therefore no big loss. But I say that that is an unfair assumption. Many people come from rough neighborhoods and have rocky starts, and they go on to do great things, be great people, even if that is only for the ones in their immediate life. They could have been brilliant kids, or they could have been terrors. I'll never know. That privilege is saved for those that were closest to them. So to the most of us, these boys are just two faces and two names, people that took some bullets and left this earth violently. They were robbed of the opportunity to show the world who they were, or to not. They were robbed of the opportunity to start families and to be great fathers, or to not. And they were robbed of the opportunity to leave this world as peacefully as possible after having lived in the way they chose to live. They didn't get justice. Their killer has never been convicted, and likely never will be, and that to me is a tragedy. When the family of Daniel Villegas were all celebrating his release, I imagine that the friends and families of Robert and Armando merely had a moment of silence as they remembered some young lads that they knew 2.5 decades ago. To shift my attention towards Daniel, the state's case against him really came down to two people, David Rangel and Oscar Gomez, and the alleged conversations that they had had with Daniel. Looking at David's first, it is my opinion that the state is actually correct in their argument, that David did come forward on his own accord to report his cousin being the shooter, rather than the story he gave about police picking him up on phone harassment charges. The reason being is that he even states in his own testimony that when he was younger, he was a good kid, a bit of a nerd, very gullible, and someone that Daniel and his friend Marcos would often play tricks on. They would play tricks on him because he was so fun to prank, as he would believe whatever they told him many times over. So with that in mind, it is plausible to me that Daniel called him up, told him he did the shooting as a prank, or maybe as an idiotic way to make his cousin respect him more. And David, being a gullible, self-proclaimed good boy, panicked. He panicked so much that he didn't know what to do or who to talk to. He went to the police to tell them what he had heard. And after facing the wrath of his family that blamed him for putting their loved one into prison, he needed to find a way to make amends. So that's when this story we heard in the testimony came out. Secondly, we have Oscar Gomez. He testifies that in his conversation with Daniel, when he asked if his friend had committed the murders, he couldn't actually recall what Daniel's answer was, even though there's the recorded police interview that shows Oscar saying clearly Daniel did it. If his testimony in the court is to be believed, then this recorded statement was untrue. So here's what I think happened. Daniel, still a teen, gets out on bond not long after the shooting. Young and foolhardy, he is probably confident that he won't be found guilty. He hangs out with one of his homeboys, and still, after everything, is trying to look cool. When asked by Oscar if he did it, he grins and alludes to the fact that he might have. If this is how the conversation played out, then it would explain why Oscar couldn't remember how Daniel answered, because the boy likely didn't answer in a clear fashion, and furthermore, it could explain why Oscar felt troubled by the interaction. So troubled, in fact, that he would go around over the next few years telling people that he is unsure if Daniel is innocent or guilty. He even admits himself on the stand that he told so many people about this that he can't remember who he spoke to anymore. All it takes is one of these people that he spoke with, and they go to the detective with that info when this case picks up media attention in 2014. The detective then, under pressure to assist the state's case, places the heat on Oscar. Tell us what you know, or we'll nail you beyond belief for these outstanding traffic infringements. That's what I think occurred anyway. And with my opinion on the table, these two key pieces of evidence still don't hold any weight. Let's say the state is 100% spot on, and both David Rangel and Oscar Gomez went to the police to tell them that they believed Daniel did this. It still doesn't change that there is strong evidence to suggest that Daniel was likely trying to fool and impress these people, and the fact that there is far more compelling evidence pointing towards the one named Rudy Flores. As a side note, I did find it a bit rich how the defense attorney would continuously paint all of the young males in this case as sweet and innocent, that they were naive victims and youthful in their ways. But he also failed to mention that the big bad Rudy Flores, the one who he painted as a terror of the town, was also only 15 years of age at the time. I read that hours before this third trial began, Daniel was offered a deal by the DA. The deal would see him plead guilty in order to get time served, and that way he would stay out of prison guaranteed. But he rejected this deal because he really wanted to battle for legal innocence. Following his decision to reject the deal, he tells his defense attorney that he was unsure if he made the right decision. Taking the deal would have guaranteed that he could be there for his family, to raise his kids, and if he loses this case, that's it. He'll never have a shot at freedom again. I can't even begin to imagine the pressure one would face when making a decision such as this, hey? I think it's a testament to who he is. Having spent 2 decades in prison, knowing what that world is like in there, he still risked everything that he ever wanted for the truth to be exposed. Not an easy choice to make. And he made the right choice there, right? He won, therefore it's time to celebrate. If only. I wish at the end of this, I could say that there is some relief to an otherwise grim story, but there's really not. From what I can tell, he is doing the best he can after being exonerated. He's raising a beautiful young family, and loves the wife who stood by him all these years. He works an honest job, attends talks regarding false confessions, and he works to help others who have been, or are in similar situations to the one that took so much of his life away. Daniel no longer being in prison is absolutely a win for an innocent man, but with that freedom comes a new set of problems. As Daniel says, once a person is locked up, they will never be the same again when they get out.
Try to rape me a few times in here. That would probably be the worst experience I've had. You know, I've got tried a few times, man, and that would probably be the worst ones right there. Someone trying to take my manhood from me.
Daniel's daughter was born 6 months before he went to prison at the age of 18.
That killed me right there. Not being there for her, I wasn't there for her when she failed. I wanted to be able to pick her up.
Here is a quote from Daniel when he spoke at a university for an event on false confessions. Quote, "Sometimes at night, I would wake up and knock on the walls of my home, and I'll check to see if I'm not dreaming. It's an effect that lasts for a lifetime. Everything you do, even right now that I'm exonerated, I can't even go to school for my kids and be there for them because they say, well, this comes up on your record. And I tell them, look, it says I'm acquitted. And they say it doesn't matter. You've been charged with capital murder. We don't want you on the school premises. I receive threats on social media and through emails. It's so difficult to adjust to life after being in jail for so long. In my mind, I was going to die in prison. After like a year or so, you start realizing how much they took from you. My daughter was a teenager and did not want to be around me because I wasn't able to be around. And throughout the years, my friends had moved on and grown into their lives. We need to focus more on people before they go to trial and get convicted. Because once you get convicted and are in prison, you come out and you're never the same. That's why it's so important for all the defense attorneys, for everybody, to do their job right. End quote.
What's up, everybody? Daniel Villegas call. Just making a video, man, for all us exonerees that come out and everybody wants to think that, hey, we got these great lives and we're fucking millionaires and we're all this bullshit. And it's just that damn lie. We ain't shit. That record, we try to get a job anywhere we want to get a job at, and what happens? That stupid record comes out. You can go to jury trial and get not convicted and still be fucked, because it always comes back to haunt us. But everybody talks about how great it is to be free, how beautiful. Shit. The thing is that right now I'm focused on what God wants me to do, because apparently everything I wanted to do wasn't in his plans. I wanted to be a correction officer, and I passed everything. The nurse said I had a health of a 25-year-old. But for some reason, I didn't get the job, and then it's because of the background check. And then 2 capital murders come out, and I sign for lows and all that shit. And every time I get an interview, they hire me, and then the background check comes back, and then it's like, you've been convicted of 2 capital murders, and I'm trying to show them that I was actually exonerated from 2 capital murders, but that doesn't mean shit. So I realized that it's not what I want. It's what God wants. And that's what I've been focused on. Trying to figure out, okay, what do you want me? What do you want me to do?